I think we can get started now. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Culture and Community in a Time of Crisis, Behind the Scenes in a Large-Scale Survey. I just want to go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. There's two ways that you can communicate with us throughout the webinar. We have the Q&A box and the chat box. If you could use the Q&A box for any questions related to the content of the webinar, that would be great. And you can use the chat to communicate back and forth and any technical issues that you have with the platform, and I can handle that. With that, I would like to introduce our panelists for today. First, we have Zoe Dowling, who is our SVP of Research here at Focus Vision. And Zoe is an eclectic blend of researcher, technologist, sociologist, and marketer, and she uses her extensive research expertise to help clients best apply Focus Vision's technological solutions. Joining Zoe, we have a group of panelists from Slaver Lynette, a firm that uses the tools of research and evaluation to help the cultural sector understand its participants and communities. First, we have Jen Benoit Bryan, who's the Vice President and Co-Director of Research. Jen has overseen a portfolio of over 60 complex client engagements over the past 6 years, using the tools of research and evaluation to help organizations meet their goals. Thanks for joining us today, Jen. Next, we have Madeline Smith, who is Project Director. She's equally expert at qualitative and quantitative research methods, and Madeline helps cultural change makers deepen participation, develop new capacities, and build audiences of the future. Welcome. Last, but certainly not least, we have Matthew Genetopoulos, who's a researcher at Slaver Lynette. Matthew supports Slaver Lynette's project directors and leadership team while collaborating with other researchers, playing a wide range of roles in both qual and quant studies. At this time, our panelists are going to dive right into the discussion. And Zoe, would you like to get started?
Absolutely. Thanks, Rachel. And hello, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I saw we've got sort of as close to home as, I'm going to say Portland. I'm in Los Angeles, but we've also got, I think it was Munich in Germany. So welcome. I'm so glad you're joining today. I'm incredibly excited for this session. This is a fascinating study on so many levels that these wonderful people who are joining me today from Slaver Lynette have conducted. And I'm going to let them do by far the majority of the talking today. They're going to go through some of the key findings of this study that's looking at culture and cultural organizations and institutions and what's happened since, COVID, the pandemic, really took hold and there was shelter in place and people can't go to cultural institutions or performances or viewings and all these different things, and they're going to talk about it much better. So they're going to talk about this study that was extremely large scale, 124,000 participants. And I think I've said enough about it. Please do put your questions in the Q&A. Please feel free to chat in the chat. We'll be looking at all of that and answering on the fly, but we're also going to have some time for Q&A at the end. So let's make this a nice interactive session. So with this, I think I'm handing over to you, Jen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zoe. We really appreciate the opportunity to share more about this study, and we're so thankful for the role that Focus Vision played in it, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a second. And thanks to all of you for joining us. We're delighted to share a few of the kind of high-level findings from this study with you today, but I think much more uniquely compared to some of the other places where we've shared about this study thus far, a real look behind the scenes about what it was like to scale a study from what we expected would be about 10,000 respondents up to 120,000 respondents. And Matt will be leading us through that part of the discussion. So I just want to show you on the next slide the range of people and organizations, nonprofit, for-profit, that all contributed to this massive effort. So at the bottom, we have Slaver Lynette, audience research, that's us. As Rachel said, we're a research and evaluation firm that works in the arts and culture sector around deepening engagement and access and equity for arts and culture organizations and audiences. And our main partners on this work were LaPlaca Cohen. They're a strategy and marketing consulting firm that also works in the arts and culture sector, who we've worked on a lot of other projects with together before this, but none of this scale. They also sort of originated and created the Culture Track platform, which is a study of cultural participants that happens every couple of years, usually with a sample of like 3,000 to 5,000, so much smaller scale than this one, but a really good grounding and base for us to build from. And then at the top of the line here, we've got our funders. So the Wallace Foundation came in as the lead funder for this first wave of research, and the Barr Foundation is the lead funder for the next wave of research. We've also been supported by ArtBridges and Terra. And then Focus Vision and Microsoft both contributed extensive in-kind support, giving us access to their software and tools and time here, which made this research possible. Lots of people across the sector also participated. Advisory Board for the Arts, Vulcan and Consulting helped us get access to lists of organizations beyond our own networks. And we used the AmeriSpeak panel at NORC to create to field the entire sort of sample of representative respondents for this study. So a whole village all contributed here in a lot of different ways. Great. So just to give you a very high level sense before I hand it off to Maddie to talk you through the findings here of what we were thinking about back in March when we started talking about the need for research and data to inform what cultural organizations would be doing and grappling with in the face of the chaos of COVID, especially in those early days. And as we were thinking about where we would want to focus our attention in this survey, this broad sense that cultural organizations need to understand what their communities need during this time of crisis and how they can fit in and serve those communities was really key. But of course, these cultural organizations are grappling with and struggling with survival as well. So we wanted to understand how can communities potentially help and support their cultural organizations during this time too. So I'm just going to hand it off to Maddie, and I'll be kind of watching the Q&A. Please, like Zoe said, we'd love for this to be more discussion and less us just talking at you. So please do feel free to jump in.
So our presentation today is going to be broken across two topics. I'm going to give us a quick spin through some of the key findings from our report, which is available for free and downloadable online. And then we're going to spend the bulk of our time with Matthew sharing with us the methodology of what it was like to manage a project of this scope with 650 organizations participating and over 124,000 responses to our survey. So going to the next slide. Matt will get a little bit more into our sample composition, but just to give you a snapshot of who we heard from, we received 124,000 responses overall, 2,000 from an NORC AmeriSpeak panel, and then 122,000 responses from arts attenders that came from 650 different participating organizations. You can see to the right of this slide just the range of organizations who shared their list with us so that we could hear from the range of arts attenders that exist across the nation. Moving on to the next slide, again, just a quick snapshot of the types of people who responded to our survey. We did weight our survey respondents, again, something Matt will get into a little bit more on the methodology portion of our discussion, but you'll see that respondents came from all over the country with a variety of backgrounds and age, the racial and ethnic background, as well as their education. Two things that I think are interesting to note on this slide, you'll see on the bottom left of the slide that 95% of respondents after weighting participated in at least one of 34 cultural activities. And we used a really broad definition of cultural activities throughout this study to include both formal activities such as attending an orchestra performance or a play, as well as more informal cultural activities like going to a public park or local library. Moving on to the next slide, of course, one of the really important things that we wanted to understand is what type of impact COVID was having on our respondents during the time the survey was fielded. I think it's important to note that our survey was fielded from late April into early May, to be exact, April 29th to May 19th. So as you take a look at all of these findings, it may be helpful to keep those dates in mind. But as you can see on this slide, COVID not only has taken a deep personal toll on the lives of people in America. As we know, people are suffering from serious health and economic consequences as a result of the pandemic. But in addition to those health and economic consequences, there were also a deep emotional fallout that people were feeling as well. what this slide outlines is, in addition to people falling ill or knowing one who has fallen ill or suffered a loss to income, people are feeling different at a time like this. They tend to be more bored, more worried and afraid, less connected to others, and feeling slightly less calm than they typically would. One thing that we also really wanted to understand is what role cultural organizations could be playing to help people through such a difficult time like this. And we saw that many people think there are ways that cultural organizations can help their communities decompress and stay connected to others during the crisis. We actually ran a factor analysis across one of our questions and identified 4 different ways that people think arts and culture organizations could help them right now. Connection and processing, and you see some things included under there. Again, helping people stay connected, helping people know what's going on, and helping them express themselves creatively. People also see a way that the arts organizations can practically support them, helping them look ahead towards the recovery or helping them deal with some financial and economic problems that may have come about because of the pandemic. And 2 additional ones, emotional support as well as escape, offering a distraction during this time or giving people other things to focus on outside of the pandemic that's affecting their everyday lives. We also see that in addition to feeling there is a role for arts and culture at a time like this, people at the same time think there are ways that arts and culture organizations can change to be better for them in the future. You see on that left side of the screen that nearly 3/4 of respondents to our survey feel that there's a way that arts and culture organizations can change to be better or more relevant to them in the future. I'd ask you to keep in mind when we talk about weighting a little bit later in this presentation, that since we were able to weight the data, this isn't just the thoughts of people who have a high affiliation to the arts or people who tend to frequent the arts, but because of the weighting scheme that we brought in, we really are hearing from the general public as well. So those who may not participate in the arts that frequently, or those who participate in, again, less formal versions of the arts. Across all of those ranges of people, they all see a way in which the arts can change to be better for them in the future. Again, in our analysis, we ran a factor analysis, and that identified for us 3 different ways that people see arts and culture changing in the future to be better for them. They see it could be much more inclusive and community focused. There are just different ways that they think they could seek higher enjoyment out of arts and culture by it changing to perhaps be more fun or less formal. And then there are ways that they think arts and culture organizations can be a little bit more reflective and innovative, particularly in ways that they can better connect with their own community and reflect the stories and people around them. Another key piece that we wanted to understand in this survey is the role that digital is playing for people at a time like this, where webinars are the new normal and we're used to spending so much time online. What role is digital feeling for people, particularly as it comes to arts and culture? You'll see in the next slide, we wanted to understand awareness, use, and how many people are paying for some of these services that are available. This slide breaks out about 3/4 of the public are aware of some sort of digital offering being offered by an arts and culture organization. So this could be a podcast, this could be a streaming performance, this could be an online class. 3/4 overall had heard or seen something like that be available. Half had participated in one of those activities. And of those who participated, about 13% paid to participate in one of the activities. So sort of as that headline up there notes, it looks like to us that digital, at first glance, seems to be a really good way to build or retain the audience you already have, but not quite yet has it become a revenue driver to fill those gaps that might be coming up during the pandemic. But one really exciting finding for us that you'll find on the next slide is that we saw through a deeper dive into our data that there are a portion of people, a good portion of people, who had not visited an organization who was offering a digital tool that they were taking advantage of. So if we use the example of Natural History Museum that you see second from the left on that top row, what that shows is of everybody who used a digital tool that was being provided by a natural history museum, over half, 50%, 57% had not visited a natural history museum in the last year. We think this is a really interesting finding to show a way in which people are connecting with organizations in different ways, or connecting with organizations that they've never visited and may never visit, or may potentially visit as a part of this digital connection. This is something that we're digging into a little bit more deeply to see how different factors around people's demographics, for example, one's race and ethnicity, or the region of the country they live in, may have had some impact on what tools they're choosing to engage in and what type of availability that cultural offering exists within their own community. So trying to understand if digital is filling a gap and broadening the audience. The last key finding that I wanted to share with you before we pass it over to talk a little bit more deeply about the methodology is, at the time the survey was fielded, what type of future planning was going on and what were people hoping to do once things hopefully return to normal. So you'll see on this next slide that at the time the survey was fielded, in late April, early May, not a whole lot of people were doing future planning for arts and culture experiences. 69% had done no planning at that time. And to the right of the screen, you'll see a breakdown of the types of things that people said they were eager to do once they were able to resume some in-person activities. The first two up there, getting together with loved ones and going out to a bar or restaurant, really matches some of those early findings we were seeing around people wanting to be connected to others or missing that connection right now. But that third finding, visiting a park, garden, or zoo, we find really interesting because in terms of cultural offerings, that seems to be the first type of cultural offering. People are interested in resuming in person when they can. And it matches other studies we're seeing throughout the field that show that people feel perhaps most comfortable returning to in-person cultural activities that are outdoors, open air, open space first. You'll see in terms of culture a little bit lower, our concert, play, or history museum, all of which we know tend to happen in controlled, enclosed spaces, which people may have some hesitation resuming. Lastly, you'll see on our final slide for the key findings that cultural organizations can make decisions that influence the public's decisions to return. We asked people across a number of factors what would most influence their decision to return to in-person cultural activities, and you see the first 5, 3 out of 5, are within an organization's control: increased cleaning, reduced admissions, and enforcement of masks. 2 others, a little bit outside of all of our control, but just interesting things to keep in mind as we're thinking about what people need to feel secure as they start resuming in-person activities.
I wonder, Maddie and Rachel, if we could pop back up to slide 14. Jan had a question about how we were defining cultural organizations on that slide. Perfect.
Sure. So the way we define cultural organizations was a bit of a survey design path that we led people down. One of the first questions in our survey was asking people a list of 34 activities that I mentioned earlier that were both formal and informal, but could be loosely defined as culture. Of that list of 34 things, what have you done in the past year? Then the following question piped in the things that they'd selected that they had done and asked them to identify whether they considered those to be arts and culture. Based on what they selected to be arts and culture, we asked them throughout the survey to use that framing, and even at times to broaden that framing, to be anything that they would really consider arts and culture. So for these following 3 questions, that was the mindset that we'd encourage the survey respondent to take, with 1 or 2 prompts throughout the survey, reminding them to think of culture as inclusively and broadly as they like.
Perfect. Thanks, Maddie.
Yeah, now I'll pass it back to Matt to talk through the methodology.
Thanks, Maddie, for that. And yeah, so I'm going to get into how did we get from the start of this, where we had thought, maybe there'd be 100 organizations, to suddenly 650 and over 100,000 responses. So as Jen said, we wanted to get in touch with audiences and see how they were doing. We knew we were going to use our networks and our contacts in the arts field, both with past and current clients and other contacts that we had. But we also recognized that using those contacts would have limitations, wouldn't really be representative of the country as a whole, both with regards to demographics and with their needs from arts and culture. So that's when we knew we would need to bring in a representative panel as well. So for that panel, we reached out to NORC to use their AmeriSpeak panel. AmeriSpeak is one of the most highly regarded survey panels around. They go to great lengths to ensure that their panel matches the census on a number of demographic elements. And when we had reached out to them, they were happy to help and recommended that we get a minimum sample of about 2,000 responses, just to make sure we had enough sample in all of the subgroups that we would be looking at to be able to make comparisons. There were some institutional roadblocks, which in a normal study wouldn't have been any issue. But here, because we were on such a time crunch to get this out to the field as quickly as possible, and more importantly, to get results back as quickly as possible because of how quickly everything was changing in those days, and still is. But so one of those things was they require all of their studies that use their panel to go through an internal IRB review process, which when we had reached out to them, I don't even think we had begun working on the survey yet. So we had to shift around how soon we could actually start and launch the survey once we had drafted the survey itself. They also told us that the study for them would need to be in the field for at least 2 weeks, which is pretty standard for us normally, but we were hoping to be in and out within 10 days because once the survey came out of the field for them, it would take them another couple of weeks to apply their weighting process to it. So, but those issues were the least of our concerns. The more difficult part was the list survey. So this was, getting the word out to all of these organizations and having their respondents for that half of the survey. So on this side, we had started out with the 4 consulting firms that Jen had pointed out earlier. So us, Lover Lynette, LaPlaca Cohen, our partners, as well as Advisory Board for the Arts and Wilkin and Consulting, that would all reach out to their clients to see who would be interested in participating. Our initial plan was to send out to all these organizations and say, send us your email lists. And then, we will send the survey out to those people. And I had some concerns about that only because to be able to house such a massive email list, especially when you've got various organizations with various standards for how they're keeping their emails. But my concerns were dwarfed by the amount of concerns that clients had about, sharing PII. So, and rightfully so. So we devised a way that we could program and house the survey on the Decipher platform, and then each organization would get an individual link with a unique URL code, so that we could then match back to, which organization had which respondent come in. We had initially estimated about 100 to 150 organizations. I went back and found our first email when we reached out to Focus Vision to see if they would help support us on this. And we had initially estimated in that email about thousands or tens of thousands responses, thousands of responses. Now, for us, that was a huge number. We usually do studies, somewhere in like just under 1,000. Rarely do we go into the 2,000s even. So to think about doing something in the tens of thousands was big for us. And for this, we were asking all of the organizations to send out to about 2,500 to 5,000 people from their email lists, that we could get a minimum of about 100 responses each. So that's how we came up with our numbers in the tens of thousands. After we had reached out to those organizations we knew, we started reaching out as well to some of the larger service and advocacy groups that oversee the specific swaths of the cultural sector here. So like the League of American Orchestras, the American Alliance of Museums, AAM, the American Public Gardens Association, as well as some others, Opera America, the Alliance for the Arts and Research Universities. And these were mostly either us showing up on weekly webinars that they were having to give our spiel, tell them where to go to sign up, or blurbs that we would include in emails that they were sending out to them.
Matt, before we go on, we had a
Yeah.
great question just about kind of duplicates, people who might be on the list of multiple cultural organizations, and how we handled that.
Yeah, it was difficult, and that was one of the shifts that we had to make when we went from thinking of we were going to house all of the emails to then having everybody send them out to their own people. There were a couple of ways, one of which was using the built-in tools in Decipher to try and curb duplicates, so that I think they use cookies on there or IP addresses to keep people from when they go to log in a second time saying, oh, I see you've already taken the survey, so thanks for doing that. The other thing was just asking organizations in their email invites to say, thank you for taking the survey. If you've already taken this from another organization, there's no need to take it multiple times. Those were pretty much the key ways that we could do our best to try and curb that. Okay, so for for getting the emails out, we had first sent out emails on Friday, April 3rd. So we started sending out to a few ones. These are the ones we were telling them to send them our lists. And then that next week, as we kind of honed in on what the process would be, we collected some organizations. By the 13th, that Monday, we had 50 organizations sign up. So we were looking pretty good for what we had expected. But then the word of the study started catching on, and it caught on like wildfire. So by that Friday, the 17th, we had 250 organizations signed up. So we had added 200 that week. By the time the sign-up deadline came, which was the following week, we had added another 500 to that list. So we had a total of 750 organizations that had reached out to say, I'm interested in the study. We wound up with about 650 that wound up participating and going through everything. So how did we get from 50 to 100 organizations to 750? And then we really needed to change our approach on how we were bringing in organizations. And it all started with, basically, we told organizations, if you're interested, send an email to Matt and let him know. And so it was just me getting an email in. I would then type their organization into an Excel spreadsheet. We had thought out of what information we needed to get from them. And then I would send each organization an individual response. Thank you for your email. Got you signed up. If they had any questions, I'd answer them there. And then I'd move on to the next one. It was pretty easy to do when I had 50 a week, but was not easy to do when I had 50 a day. So we wound up, I wound up relying on some employees internally who had time or who had made some time to help me out. And so I wound up setting up an auto response, which is the first time I've ever had to do that while I'm actually sitting at my desk. But an auto response where, as people would email me, then it would say, thank you for your email. I've received it. You'll be signed up as long as you're before the deadline, but just give me a day or two to get back to you. And then I would pass on those emails to my colleagues internally. They would enter them into that Excel sheet, and then I would send out mass emails through mail merge every few days, just giving everybody the update and what they needed to know going forward. Once we had gotten all of those organizations in and the deadline had come, we looked at the list of those that had signed up and realized that we had some pretty big gaps, that we just weren't serving enough small organizations, and especially serving those that served Lana communities, which are African, Latinx, Asian, Arab, and Native American focused arts organizations. So we made an extra push that following week to reach out to some of these organizations to make sure that their responses and their voices were also being included, so that our efforts to be inclusive were genuine and not just say, we've put together the largest arts study, but it's only the largest arts organizations as well, because we didn't think that would be really helpful to everyone in the field.
Just a quick question we got from Karen, which is about sort of the motivation for these organizations. Why were they signing up in such high numbers to participate? And my inclination here is that what we heard from them was that the fact that we were offering both access to that organization's own responses and sort of a distillation of their information so that they could get very relevant, useful information tailored to them, as well as sort of a sense of how they compared to the national picture during this time of real transition and change was particularly appealing to people. And just, you know, in turmoil, you're looking for information, I think, in order to make decisions. And so people were really eager to get any additional information about audience needs and wants during this time. But Maddie and Matt, other insights about what you heard about why people signed up?
It was free. So that was a huge part as well. And that was all based on the funding we got from Wallace and from BAR, as well as the other funders, and the support we got from Focus Vision too, so that we were able to continue taking in organizations and, you know, having more and more respondents because those were being donated in kind. So that was a very helpful part.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so moving on to the programming of the survey, you know, we're used to programming one, maybe a few surveys for one client. Here we were programming one survey for 650 clients. Not only that, it's on a much abbreviated timeline than what we're used to. So the first issue that we had going into it was we knew that the survey length might be a problem. We had, I think, initially billed it at about 15 minutes. And kudos to Madeline and Jen for keeping this under control, because we had a lot of advisors on the survey side to make sure that everyone was being included and we were getting in the important questions that we needed to ask, because we felt like we only had one shot to get this out there. So we wound up having to prioritize some questions as kind of must-haves. And then we had a follow-up at the end where we said, you know, you're done with the survey. If you would like, you know, we've got a few more questions. It won't take you more than 5 minutes. And click here if you want to answer those. We wound up with over 75% opting to take those questions, which was great. The other thing that I had to think about that I had never really put too much time into was the design and what it looked like. I don't come from a programming background or a design background, so, you know, prior to this, my feelings on studies were always, you know, did I program it so it works? Yes. Can you read everything, or, you know, we're not overlapping stems or things like that. So great. But that was usually the extent of it. And I knew that wasn't going to cut it when we were going to have, you know, 50,000 people taking a survey on their computer, another 50,000 taking the survey on their phones. And we wanted to get everybody to complete the survey. So we wound up making the design very button heavy, which I found looked fine on the computer and worked great on phones as well. There weren't, you know, those little small bubbles that people are trying to click on. And it was just really, I think, user friendly for that. And then finally, with all of these organizations we had, it was hard to just have one kind of monolithic version and say, you know, this is our survey, take it or leave it, because we felt a lot of people would leave it. So we had to make some customizations within there. So for example, we had some organizations that we had an incentive drawing at the end, and some organizations either didn't want to be a part of that for their respondents, or they weren't allowed to by their institution. So we had to add a tag to their URL so that it wouldn't show any mention of that drawing when those people came in. Similarly, we had a few Canadian institutions that had signed up, and they have, you know, obviously different demographics than we do. So different standards for their postal codes, their education levels are somewhat different. They don't earn income in US dollars. So things like that had to be accounted for, again, using the URL variables.
One other thing I wanted to share really quick on the last side is just building on your point about the module questions. I started doing that in 2 recent surveys, and I'm really surprised by the number of people who opt in to answering additional questions, which I think is could be a useful tip when you're thinking about survey length. You know, when we're doing an email survey, sometimes that does give us the opportunity to do a bit of a longer survey, 10 minutes, let's say. But when we're doing an on-site survey, intercepting somebody at an organization, we usually want to keep those a little bit shorter. But recently I tried doing an optional module on an on-site survey and saw similar numbers to the national study where nearly 80% of people opted in to do the additional questions. And I also did one with an email survey recently, and that was about 85% of people who opted in to ask additional things. So it could be an interesting tool to play with. And since we asked how Matt categorized them as the need to have questions earlier, which included a lot of demographics, we would be able to compare those who answered the required questions versus the optional questions to see if they looked different in any way that we would want to take into account as well. It's just something I wanted to share from a design perspective.
And before you jump on, Matt, I saw there was a question asking what exactly was Focus Vision's role. I thought that I might be a good person to take that. So just to clear up, so when Slava Linnet came to us and said, we would like to do this study, and could you help us out with the Decipher platform, with Focus Vision Decipher platform, we were absolutely on board to offer up the use of the platform for free, as well as our support. So basically, we facilitated Slava Linnet programmed. I know you're talking about how you programmed. They programmed themselves in-house. But we provided the platform, the hosting, and then also support on just helping troubleshoot, because we wanted this to be successful as well. And so we provided that, sort of help support, watching how things were going in field as well. So that was our role.
Yeah, and I worked a lot with the Focus Vision team to just make sure that it was all went smoothly, and had nothing but good things to say about their support team. Any issues I had, it seemed like within minutes they were taking care of them, fixing, offering solutions for me, which was good because minutes is basically what we were dealing with to get this study out as quickly as possible. So just before we were about to send out all of the links to the organizations so that they could test the survey, so that was going to be on a Monday, and then we were going to launch on that Wednesday. I got a voicemail and an email from Matt Dill at Focus Vision, who was working with us, and we had been keeping him up to speed on what had been going on, because we had initially said, can you help us out with a few tens of thousands of responses, and now it was looking like it was going to be possibly into the hundreds of thousands. So we wanted to make sure they were still okay with that. And so Matt wrote to me and said, so glad you guys are getting such great interest, but if you have 2 million people trying to take the survey at one time, that's going to cause some issues with our servers. And so he had suggested that we would need to keep it at about or below sending out 65,000 invites an hour. So again, we had asked these organizations to send out to about 2,500 to 5,000 people of their email lists. And so we had not been policing that number to say, how many are you going to send it out to? So we just had to guess, worst case scenario, everyone's going to send it out to 5,000, even though we knew that wouldn't necessarily be the case. But one thing Matt had suggested was just assigning everybody a time slot to send out the survey over the span of a few days. So that's Monday lunchtime. We're supposed to launch on Wednesday. Everybody else at this point thinks we're launching on Wednesday. So Madeline, Jen, and I hop on several calls that afternoon. And by that evening, we had come up with a system where we had randomly assigned everyone a time slot based on their time zone. These were 2-hour time slots that they could send the emails out over a 5-day span, so between Wednesday and Sunday of that week. And then anybody who could not, so that we didn't have to try and accommodate all of these additional requests of, I can't do it on Wednesday, can you do it on Thursday? So we just asked them, if you can't make your time, send it out the next Monday or Tuesday, and then hoped that, enough people would not have to all shift to Monday and Tuesday, that we wouldn't, just be pushing this off. So I was super concerned that we were going to send this out and everyone was going to be like really upset that we made these changes last minute, but they were super understanding. They were very appreciative. And for the most part, they followed the instructions and the time slots that we had given them. So we were successful in not having any server side issues there. I see we have a question. So yeah. So as far as, things were changing constantly, and we were looking at, surveys that were being published as we were about to go live.
Do you want to say the question? I'm not sure everybody's read it.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So Diana writes, writing, deploying, and analyzing surveys takes time. In a time like this where things are changing every week, for how long are these results relevant? As the survey was conducted back in April and May, how are you planning on addressing this issue? And I think I'll let Jen and Madeline talk a little bit on the design side, but it was something that we understood because we were seeing it by late April. There were surveys that were being released that had been done in mid-March, and they just had no relevancy because they're asking, oh, people are starting to shut down. What are you doing? And now by the end of April, everything was shut down. So those responses weren't really helping anybody. But I think we put a lot of conscious effort into the design part of it to make sure that we would be asking questions that could be acted on and could be, even in June and July, as we didn't know how things would change, still be able to analyze. Jen or Maddie, did you have anything else to add?
Just that I think it's the challenge of operating during a time when things are changing so quickly, right? That it meant that everything was escalated in terms of how quickly we needed to work, both to design the survey and get it in the field, but also to get results out to individual participating organizations, which came within just a couple of weeks of the survey closing. All the 653 organizations had access to their own data with charts that they could look at. So, and I think we've since realized that some of the questions are more time-bound than others, right? Like the question about, to what extent are you making plans for future arts and culture activities? That was very much of the moment and doesn't help as much now. Whereas some of the questions about what kind of change do you want to see when cultural organizations reopen, that feels much more long-lasting. So there's kind of an interesting mix of kind of expiration dates for the usefulness of these questions. The other way that we're planning to handle this is to have a second wave of the survey that includes some questions that can be compared over time, but also includes new questions that are about that context and that time that are new.
Yeah, I was going to share a similar answer to Jen's, where there are certain questions that we knew as soon as it came out of the field, the data is going to be a little bit dated. Some of the earlier stuff around people, what percentage of people are at a stay-at-home order, what percentage of people are feeling a certain emotion is going to shift day by day, but certain things around what they hope arts organizations could do for them or the need that they see arts organizations filling could still be useful information for orgs to plan around. Even some of the digital content pieces where, sure, the number of people participating is going to shift over time. We had additional questions around what did you get out of that digital activity that we hoped would be really useful information for arts organizations to plan around, either as they reopen or think about what their online offerings were going to look like.
Thank you, guys. So once the survey had closed, we came out of the field in, I think, late May or mid-May maybe. And we had our 22,000 responses, another 2,000 from the AmeriSpeak panel, but there were still a couple of issues that we had to solve from this point. So first, as we had kind of anticipated, the list population skewed very heavily white. It was higher on income and higher in education than the US population. So that was an area we worked with some of the statisticians at NORC, separate from their AmeriSpeak panel, to help develop a weighting scheme that took that into account. And then the other issue we had was, how do we share these results with 650 organizations? But besides the full report that we were planning to do with our partners at LaPlaca Cohen, all of these organizations wanted to be able to see what their own respondents had said too, and this was something we had promised them. So we had initially planned on just sharing the Decipher crosstabs, but sharing each one individually so that, you know, organization A couldn't see organization B's results was going to be a lot of work, even when there was, you know, the idea that there may be 100 of them, and it was going to be impossible with 650, just the time that it would take to set all of that up. So we started looking to other methods, and for that I'm going to pass it back to Madeline to talk more about what we wound up landing on.
Sure. So as Jen and Matt have shared, you know, one of the key motivators for people to participate is getting access to their own data. But what we felt, and because of that, we felt an obligation to organizations to get data in their hands as soon as possible. So we ended up coming up with two different tools, both hosted through Plotly, as different ways of sharing out information for organizations. So first, we created charts for every single question on the survey that showed each organization's data, just showing their overalls for their organization. And we're able to send a specific link to each organization where they could download just their data in chart form in Excel. We actually hosted a webinar after that with some organizations coming to something like this as we talked them through it so they understood what they were seeing in the charts, the design of the question, and what some of these things hopefully could help them answer for their own organization by looking at the data. After that, we built upon that initial skeleton setup of charts to create comparisons that people could toggle between to look at their own data versus the overalls of all of the national data we collected, their own data against their own local geography. There, I believe we used the, 12 census zones so that they compare by their responses by their own region. And then we also allowed them to compare themselves to other attenders of their same type. So if it was an art museum, we had all other art museum respondents for them to compare against. Again, if it would be a botanical garden, all other botanic gardens for them to compare against. So whatever would be a relevant genre for them to learn from. So that was two ways that we both gave organizations information to their data as soon as we could, and then also gave them a sense to explore on their own how they measure up to these different splits that we provided them. In terms of what's next for the study, we were able to talk you through some of the key findings in the earlier portion of our presentation. But of course, if you'd like to see the full report with a lot more information, please go to culturetrack.com and you'll be able to find a free download version of the survey. In terms of what's coming for next steps, we plan to do a set of qualitative interviews and/or focus groups with other cultural arts attenders, again, with that broad definition of culture, to understand a lot of the things that we first started exploring in the survey. How are they being affected right now? Where do the arts live in their lives? And what are they looking for the arts to provide during times like this? As well as what is the role digital playing, or how could that role be made better? We're also in the midst of doing continued additional analysis of the Wave 1 data. I mean, it's amazing what 124,000 respondents will let you do. You can slice and dice the data in so many different ways that I am never able to do when I have only about 1,000 responses. So it's really exciting. One thing that we are starting to dive in real deeply is any differences that we're seeing by race and ethnicity, that how people self-identify may change the way they interact with the arts or what they look for from the arts. Shortly, we hope to be able to release a tool that we've been creating in collaboration with Microsoft that'll let the public compare our data to some of those overall key splits that I just talked about on the last slide. So letting the public see our overall numbers against somebody who is a member, because getting to see our overall numbers against somebody who identifies as African American or Black, so that we can make this data even more widely available for other researchers and those who are interested to dig in a little bit more deeply. And as Jen already mentioned, we do have plans for a Wave 2 survey, which will dive further into some of the issues that we are starting to address in this first wave, as well as the qual work, as well as building on some things that have always been important, but become even more important at a time like this, such as social justice issues and the roles that can play or not play in arts and culture.
Great, that's the end of our presentation. We can take it off so we can, perfect, see each other a little bit more. We've loved answering questions as they've come up. We'd welcome more of them. And I think Zoe,
yeah,
you.
I've got a few, so I'm going to be watching to see if anybody else is jumping in. But thank you. I think this has been a really great flavor of such an interesting study, both on the topic, but also just what's going on behind the scenes. And it's a wonderful story of, I think, collaboration. With you and your immediate partner, La Placo, and then the different partners in the cultural organizations. So I think the first question I had was, with the cultural organizations, and we know that it was free for them to participate, so that was a great incentive, and they were keen for the data. Have you got any sense of what they are doing with their data and what kind of decisions and impact that it's having?
Yeah, we actually have a panel that we're planning with Visitor Studies Association later in September, and I'm happy to share the details about that. But one of the sessions of that will be all about how are people using and activating this data, cultural organizations. And we're hearing it come through in a lot of ways. Very early on, we were talking to the Kennedy Center around their July 4th celebration, how the lawn would be open, and they were trying to figure out how do we message and what do we message about to ensure the safety of visitors and guests, even in an outdoor environment. And so some of the information that was much more timely at that point around kind of enforced mask wearing and social distancing, and that informed their kind of marketing campaign and their signage around the Kennedy Center in order to make sure that people would be getting the information they needed for that. But I think at a higher level, one of the places that organizations have been most interested and surprised around this data is with respect to some of the digital findings, both in terms of how widespread use of digital offerings is from arts and culture during COVID, as well as its potential to sort of enlarge and diversify those who are participating. And so we've heard from a few organizations that has helped them make the case internally for additional resources going to digital during COVID, and also for potentially sustaining that support in a longer term way to continue to engage the more diverse audiences that are coming through digital.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I think that's exciting. Those are the types of things that I think are you kind of wanting to hear and get from the data that people are using that is having an impact. There's two questions come in, and I think these are both linked. So let's first go to, are you tracking how the organizations are using the findings? Is there, I mean, that could be quite a mammoth task in and of itself.
Yeah, Matt, do you want to speak to sort of our plans to reach out?
Yeah, so we, especially as we're getting ready to gear up for the second wave, we're going to be reaching out to these organizations to give them a brief survey, basically, where they can let us know, have you been able to access your data? What have you used it for? And kind of get some of that information directly from that. But that's coming soon, that we'll be setting that up.
Yeah, and also just asking them what did we not ask that would have helped, right? Like, what do you need to know now that might even be different from what you wanted to know back in March and April?
And that makes so much sense, because like you've said repeatedly, things certainly change so fast. And when this field, and when you were just designing the survey, it was all so new and fresh. And if I'm thinking back to where I was back then, I was thinking, yeah, life will go back to normal in a few months, whatever normal is, and we'll put this behind us. And of course, it's nothing of the sort. So I think sort of a real evolution into that second wave is going to be quite fascinating, in that we recognize this as a longer term change that's happening to us. This other question that came in, and it's actually, I had something similar in the sense, was there any surprising differences between, and by global data, I think they're meaning just the overall data and the localized data. And mine was along the same line, massive data set. Was there anything that surprised you as you're looking in at it?
Maddie, do you want to speak to that?
I think we're probably all going to have a slightly different answer for this. The two things that most surprised me are really the active role people still saw arts and culture organizations, the active role that they think arts and culture organizations still can have at a time like this. You know, working in the sector I of course think arts and culture organizations are really important, but I have to remind myself that I might be in a little bubble, and for other people it may not play as big a role in their lives, particularly when we're facing a time like this where everything is super different and we are just trying to make it through day by day. I was really surprised to see how many people think that there is something arts and cultural organizations can do across a wide range. Remember, we talked about those 4 different types of ways that they thought arts and cultural organizations could help them. And as we're starting to dig into differences based on race and ethnicity, we are seeing some clear differences in the ways that people see arts and culture playing a role in their lives based on their racial and ethnic background. For certain groups, like one I've looked at is those identify as white and Caucasian, they really seem to embrace arts and culture organizations for the social opportunity, the social connection, and the learning that it gives them. Whereas when we took a deeper, closer look at those who identify as African American or Black, they look to arts and culture for a little bit more of a deeper emotional connection, for truth and healing. And so all of those things have been really interesting for me as I get to pull things apart.
And I guess with respect to geography, just to build on that, we've pulled data for New York, for Boston, for Kansas City, for Colorado, for Massachusetts, when there's been, requests for us to talk about what does this regional profile look like. And it has been really interesting to see where, how different parts of the country during the same 2-week period had pretty different experiences with COVID, both in terms of the sort of economic and health impacts that people were experiencing, as well as with respect to sort of how important they think of arts and culture being. And we also see some interesting differences by sort of rural versus urban in this data set, that in more urban centers where there's a lot more arts and culture, there's often a higher perception of value or need from those arts and culture organizations than in less urban areas. So yeah, some regional differences, not as much as we might have expected. So like when you cut it by census zone, it's not as extensive. It's more when you get to a more local kind of area and you're comparing that you start to see real differences emerge.
And that makes a lot of sense. We're running really short on time. There's, I think, a really quick question. Could organizations that haven't participated in the earlier survey participate in the second wave, particularly if it's small or serves minorities?
Yes, lots more to come on that. We are grappling with what it might look like for this to grow further and what bounds we might need to put around it. But one of the core tenets here is that we want to expand participation among organizations that are serving, particular segments of society. So BIPOC or Alana serving organizations in particular, we want to amplify those voices as much as we possibly can. So I can say with confidence that there will be room for those organizations to participate, and we'll be sort of trying to figure out how do we structure the sample and participation to hear from all of the cultural, as much of the cultural sector and as wide and representative a way as we possibly can.
Great. And that is exciting. That is exciting. So we are out of time. There's a question asking around the paying for digital content. I know you're diving into the data and probably really starting to look at that. So I would say to the person, Connie, reach out to have a look at the report. I'm sure Jen, Maddie, and Matt would be very happy to answer questions directly. And I think also stay tuned, because there's going to be a lot more to come from, a massive data set like that. It's unbelievable and exciting. So again, thank you very much for sharing. I think also just the process for me, I know this was like, wow, we don't hear about a study of this size very, very often. And so really great to hear about, how you pulled it all together. So thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate your time and hearing your story. I hope everybody attending enjoyed hearing the findings, the genesis of the study, the findings, and also just how it all came together. So thank you very much for joining. And with that, we are going to wrap up and call it a day. So thank you very much, everybody, and I hope you'll join us again for another session soon. Bye-bye now.
Thanks so much, Zoe. Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.